As the harsh New England winter of 1692 gripped Salem village, an eerie unease began to settle over the community. The air was thick with tension, not just from the biting cold, but from something far more sinister brewing beneath the surface. In the candlelit rooms of modest farmhouses, young women huddled together, their whispers barely audible above the howling wind. They spoke of dreams and visions, of spirits and shadows that danced at the edge of their vision. Little did they know that their innocent games of fortune-telling would soon ignite a fire that would consume their entire world. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a dark obsession had gripped Europe for over a century. The specter of witchcraft haunted the minds of both peasants and nobility alike. Tales of nocturnal gatherings, demonic pacts, and malevolent spells spread like wildfire, leaving a trail of fear and suspicion in their wake. As the flames of witch hunts consumed the lives of thousands, mostly older women whose only crime was their knowledge of healing herbs and midwifery, these terrifying stories began to seep into the consciousness of the American colonies. Salem town, a bustling port filled with the shouts of sailors and the creaking of ships' masts, stood in stark contrast to its inland neighbor, Salem village. Here, among the rolling fields and dense forests, a different kind of tension simmered. The divide between the wealthy merchants of the town and the hard-working farmers of the village ran deep, like a festering wound that refused to heal. At the heart of this discord stood two families: the Porters, with their fine clothes and connections to the prosperous town merchants, and the Putnams, champions of the village's independence and the voice of the struggling farmers. Their rivalry, once confined to hushed conversations and sidelong glances, was about to erupt into something far more dangerous. Into this powder keg stepped Samuel Parris, a man whose ambition burned as fiercely as his Puritan faith. Appointed as the village's new pastor through the Putnam's influence, Parris arrived with his family and an enslaved woman named Tituba, a mysterious figure from distant Barbados. As Parris schemed to increase his wealth and power, the flames of discord in Salem village grew ever higher. Little did anyone realize that the innocent games of young girls and the deep-seated rivalries of adults were about to collide in a perfect storm of fear, suspicion, and hysteria that would forever change the face of Salem and American history. As winter's icy grip began to loosen, a strange fever took hold of Salem village. It started with whispers, barely audible above the crackling hearths, of young girls gathering in secret. Their laughter, once light and carefree, took on an eerie quality that sent shivers down the spines of even the most stoic villagers. In the flickering candlelight of a small, cramped room, a group of girls huddled around a glass of water, their eyes wide with anticipation. With trembling hands, one of them cracked an egg, letting the white slip into the glass. They leaned in, breaths held, as the translucent substance twisted and turned, forming shapes that promised to reveal the faces of their future husbands. This innocent game of Venus glass seemed harmless enough, but little did they know it was about to unleash a terror beyond their wildest imaginations. As the days grew longer, so did the shadows that seemed to follow these girls. Their behavior became increasingly erratic, bodies contorting in impossible angles, screams piercing the night, complaints of unseen forces pinching and biting their flesh. The village watched in growing horror as the once cheerful girls transformed before their eyes. Whispers of explanations rippled through the community like a dark undercurrent. Some spoke of hidden traumas, of secrets buried deep within the girls' hearts. Others pointed to the very bread they ate, suggesting that the rye might be tainted with a sinister fungus that could twist the mind. But such rational explanations found no purchase in a world where the veil between the natural and supernatural seemed gossamer thin. Instead, the villagers turned to a darker source of understanding. A book, its pages yellow with age, circulated among the literate few. Memorable providences, relating to witchcraft and possessions, painted vivid pictures of demonic influence that mirrored the girls' afflictions with chilling accuracy. For those already inclined to see the devil's work in every shadow, this was all the proof they needed. As the girls' fits worsened, their cries echoing through the village like banshees, adults found themselves drawn into the drama. Long simmering disputes and petty jealousies bubbled to the surface, providing fertile ground for suspicion and accusation. The attention lavished upon the afflicted girls proved intoxicating, drawing others into their orbit, each new victim adding fuel to the growing inferno of hysteria. When the local physician, his scientific knowledge exhausted, threw up his hands in defeat, the village turned to a more sinister diagnosis: witchcraft. Under the stern gaze of the village preacher, his eyes burning with righteous fury, the girls finally gave names to their tormentors. 3 women, already outcasts in their own way, found themselves at the center of a storm they could never have imagined. Tituba, the mysterious slave from distant shores; Sarah Good, whose sharp tongue and desperate circumstances had long made her a target of whispers; and Sarah Osborne, an old woman whose past indiscretions had never been truly forgiven. As these names fell from the girls' lips, a chill swept through Salem Village. The witch hunt had begun, and no one could predict where it would end or who would be consumed by its voracious appetite for justice and vengeance. The dank, musty air of the makeshift courtroom hung heavy with fear and anticipation. 3 women stood before the stern-faced magistrates, their fates balanced on a knife's edge. Sarah Good, her once fiery spirit now dampened by fear, defiantly shook her head. Sarah Osborne, bent with age and worry, mumbled incoherent denials. But it was Tituba, her dark eyes wide with a terror born of more than just the accusations, who would shatter the uneasy silence. As the days of interrogation wore on, whispers slithered through the village like venomous snakes. Some spoke of the sounds of lashing coming from the Paris household, where Tituba resided. Was the good Reverend protecting his daughter and niece? Or was there something more sinister at play? On that fateful day, March 1st, 1692, the air in the courtroom seemed to thicken as Tituba began to speak. Her words, at first hesitant, soon poured forth like a dark tide. She spoke of midnight visitations from a man in black, his eyes glowing with hellfire as he urged her to sign his unholy book. She described conversations with animals that should not speak, their voices dripping with malevolent intent. And then the words that would ignite an inferno of hysteria. She had made a pact with the devil himself. As Tituba's tale unfolded, implicating not just herself but Good and Osborne as well, a collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. But it was her final, chilling allusion to others involved in this devilish conspiracy that truly set Salem ablaze with fear and suspicion. The clang of iron bars echoed through the village as all 3 women were thrown into the dank prison. For Tituba, this marked the beginning of a nightmare that would stretch far beyond the witch trials. Even when the hysteria finally subsided, she found herself trapped, abandoned by Paris, and sold to an unknown fate like a piece of property. In the wake of Tituba's confession, Salem descended into chaos. The once quiet village became a cauldron of accusations and counter-accusations. Young girls, their eyes wild with a mix of fear and exhilaration, began to fall into fits of supposed possession. At the heart of this growing storm stood the Putnam family, their influence spreading like tendrils of poison through the community. Thomas Putnam and his brother Edward, their faces set with grim determination, became the architects of Salem's downfall. Under the guise of protecting the afflicted girls, they filed complaint after complaint, their quills scratching out accusations that would send dozens to the gallows. The Putnam's enemies, both old and new, found themselves in the crosshairs of this deadly witch hunt. As the trials progressed, Thomas Putnam's hand could be seen everywhere. His distinctive script graced over 100 court documents, each one another nail in the coffin of Salem's accused. The Putnam family, once merely influential, now held the power of life and death over their neighbors. In the flickering candlelight of Salem's homes, families huddled together, whispering prayers and wondering who might be next. The witch hunt, born from the fears of a few young girls and fanned by the ambitions of powerful men, had taken on a life of its own. And as the summer of 1692 approached, no one in Salem could predict where this tide of hysteria would finally break. The once peaceful streets of Salem now echoed with whispers and accusations as the witch hunt spiraled out of control. No one was safe, not even the most respected members of the community. The arrest of Rebecca Nurse and Martha Corey sent shockwaves through Salem. These women, pillars of the church and models of virtue, now stood accused of the vilest sins imaginable. If such paragons could fall, who among them was truly innocent? The hysteria reached a fever pitch when even children became targets. In a scene that would haunt Salem for generations, 4-year-old Dorothy Good stood trembling before the stern-faced magistrates. Her tiny voice, barely audible in the oppressive silence of the courtroom, was twisted into a damning confession. The innocence of childhood itself seemed tainted by the specter of witchcraft. As spring blossomed outside, Salem withered under the weight of suspicion. Dozens were dragged from their homes, their protestations of innocence drowned out by the cacophony of accusations. The newly established court of Oyer and Terminer loomed over the town like a malevolent shadow, its 7 judges ready to pass judgment on the accused. Inside the courtroom, a surreal and terrifying spectacle unfolded. The accused, stripped of legal counsel, stood alone against the weight of their community's fear and suspicion. In the gallery, young women writhed and screamed, their theatrical displays of affliction serving as damning evidence against the helpless defendants. The court's acceptance of spectral evidence opened the floodgates to a torrent of fantastical accusations. Tales of spectral attacks and midnight Sabbaths with the devil himself were given the same weight as physical evidence. In this twisted logic, the only path to salvation was confession and naming others. A cruel choice that tore families and friendships apart. For many of the accused, the decision to maintain their innocence in the face of certain death was rooted in a profound, if fatal, faith. To confess to witchcraft, to admit commerce with the devil, was to condemn one's immortal soul. Even as the gallows loomed, these individuals clung to their beliefs, choosing earthly death over eternal damnation. Fear silenced those who might have spoken out against the injustice unfolding before them. The few brave souls who dared to question the legitimacy of the trials found themselves swiftly under suspicion, the finger of accusation turning upon them with terrifying speed. On June 2nd, the warm summer air carried the somber tolling of church bells as Bridget Bishop faced her accusers. At 60 years old, she stood before the court, a woman who had already tasted the bitter draught of suspicion a decade earlier. Her reputation, her very character, seemed tailor-made for the role of witch in the eyes of her fearful neighbors. As Bishop's trial unfolded, Salem held its collective breath. The verdict would set the tone for all that was to follow, and the air was thick with anticipation. Little did they know that this was merely the opening act in a tragedy that would forever scar the conscience of a nation. The summer of 1692 descended upon Salem like a suffocating shroud, bringing with it a heat that seemed to intensify the madness gripping the town. At the center of this inferno stood Bridget Bishop, a woman whose very existence seemed to offend the sensibilities of her Puritan neighbors. Bridget was a splash of color in Salem's drab landscape. Her vibrant dresses and outspoken nature made her stand out in a community that prized conformity above all else. The taverns she ran buzzed with laughter and gossip, a stark contrast to the somber meeting houses that dominated Salem's spiritual life. Her multiple marriages and rumored dalliances were whispered about in hushed tones, each retelling adding another layer to her notorious reputation. As Bridget stood before the court, the air thick with tension and fear, even her own family turned against her. Her brother-in-law's damning testimony fell like a hammer blow, sealing her fate. In just over a week, the machinery of injustice ground inexorably forward. On June 10th, under a sky as blue and indifferent as it had ever been, Bridget Bishop climbed the stairs to the gallows on Gallows Hill. Her final protests of innocence were lost to the wind as the trapdoor opened beneath her feet. The execution of Bridget Bishop was like a match thrown onto dry tinder. The flames of hysteria roared higher, consuming victim after victim. Even the most respected members of the community were not safe. Rebecca Nurse, a pious grandmother of 71, found herself in the crosshairs of accusation. The very woman who had once scolded young girls for their wicked folly of fortune-telling now stood accused of the darkest arts. Rebecca's trial was a travesty of justice that would haunt Salem for generations. Even when initially found not guilty, the shrieking protests of her accusers and the machinations of Chief Justice Stoughton conspired to seal her doom. A simple misunderstanding, exacerbated by her failing hearing, was twisted into a confession of guilt. Her final, desperate explanation fell on deaf ears, drowned out by the roar of hysteria. On July 19th, under the merciless summer sun, Rebecca Nurse and 4 other women, including the defiant Sarah Good, met their end on Gallows Hill. Sarah's final words, accusing the judge of being as much a wizard as she was a witch, hung in the air like a curse. The hangings continued with brutal efficiency. August 19th saw 5 more victims, including the Reverend George Burroughs. Even as he stood on the gallows, reciting the Lord's Prayer with a clarity that should have proven his innocence, the machinery of death ground on. His final act of faith, meant to prove his innocence, was dismissed as a clever trick by the devil. As summer gave way to autumn, the toll of Salem's madness continued to mount. On September 22nd, 8 more souls were torn from this world, including Martha Corey. The accusation against her elderly husband showed that no one, regardless of age or infirmity, was beyond suspicion. With each creaking of the gallows, with each life snuffed out in the name of righteousness, Salem sank deeper into a nightmare of its own making. The town that had once prided itself on its piety now stood revealed as a place where fear and suspicion reigned supreme, where innocence was no protection against the crushing weight of hysteria. As autumn's chill settled over Salem, the witch hunt's brutality reached new heights. The fate of Giles Corey stood as a grim testament to the madness that had consumed the town. Refusing to enter a plea, Corey faced a death more horrific than the gallows. For 3 agonizing days, he lay beneath a growing weight of stones, his body slowly crushed as onlookers watched in morbid fascination. His last words, a defiant "more weight," echoed through Salem like a damning indictment of the proceedings. The hysteria, like a virulent plague, began to spread beyond Salem's borders. Even as influential voices, like that of a respected minister, began to speak out against the use of spectral evidence, the accusations showed no sign of abating. It wasn't until the finger of suspicion pointed at the governor's own wife that the tide began to turn. In October, as the trees shed their leaves and the land prepared for winter's embrace, a change swept through Salem. The court of oyer and terminer, that instrument of injustice, was replaced by a superior court of judicature. With this change came a ray of hope. Spectral evidence, the foundation upon which so many had been condemned, was no longer admissible. Yet the wheels of justice, once set in motion, were slow to stop. Trials continued into the new year, though with markedly different results. Only 3 more souls found themselves condemned, a stark contrast to the dozens who had faced the noose in the months before. As spring blossomed in 1693, Governor Phipps issued a sweeping pardon, freeing those still held in custody and exonerating those who had been convicted. But for 19 souls hanged, 1 crushed beneath stones, and 5 who had perished in the squalor of Salem's jails, the pardon came too late. In the years that followed, a pall of shame and regret settled over Salem. Judge Samuel Sewell, in a rare act of public contrition, stood before his congregation to acknowledge his role in the tragedy. His admission of guilt was a first step towards healing, but the scars left by the witch trials would never fully fade. Ironically, from the ashes of this dark chapter arose principles that would form the bedrock of American jurisprudence. The right to legal representation, to face one's accuser, and the presumption of innocence. All these fundamental tenets of justice were born from the injustices witnessed in Salem. As for the young girls whose accusations had sparked the inferno, their fates remained shrouded in mystery. Betty Paris, one of the original accusers, was spirited away during the trials, perhaps to shield her from the chaos she had helped unleash. She would go on to lead a seemingly ordinary life, marrying and raising a family before her death in 1760. Abigail Williams, whose finger had pointed at 57 souls, vanished from the pages of history. Her fate after the trials remains unknown, her story ending as abruptly as it had begun in that fateful winter of 1692. But it was Ann Putnam Jr., the 12-year-old daughter of Thomas and Ann Putnam, who perhaps bore the heaviest burden. Her accusations, more numerous than any other, had sent over 60 people to face the court's judgment. The sudden death of her parents in 1699 left her alone to face the consequences of her actions. In 1706, in a moment of public reckoning that must have required immense courage, Anne stood before her community to offer an apology. Her words, tinged with regret, and perhaps a hint of the terror that had gripped her young mind during those dark days, offered a glimmer of closure to a community still struggling to come to terms with its past. As Salem moved into a new century, the witch trials became a cautionary tale, a dark chapter in its history that served as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked fear and hysteria. The town that had once been consumed by the hunt for witches now found itself haunted by the ghosts of its own making, forever changed by the events of that fateful year. In the aftermath of the Salem witch trials, Anne confessed that she had been deluded by the devil, her voice trembling with regret as she begged for forgiveness. The people of Salem, perhaps still haunted by the hysteria, allowed her to join the congregation of the village church. But her redemption came with a heavy price. 10 years later, Anne passed away at the age of 37, a quiet end to a life once at the center of chaos. Elizabeth Hubbard, an orphan working as a maid for her aunt and uncle, Rachel and William Griggs, found herself entangled in the events that shook Salem. It was her uncle, Dr. Griggs, who had first diagnosed the bewitchment of the young girls. Elizabeth, driven by unknown forces, testified against 29 people. Some believed that her motivations were deeper than mere fear. Perhaps, as an orphan with little hope for a future, she sought to direct the town's gaze toward her plight. Whatever the reason, her story, much like that of Abigail Williams, vanished from history after the trials. Mary Walcott, only 16 years old, lived next door to the Paris family, making her the step-cousin of Anne Jr. Unlike the others, her behavior in the courtroom was puzzling. At times, she claimed to see visions, overwhelmed by afflictions. At other times, she simply sat quietly, knitting as chaos erupted around her. Eventually, Mary married a local man, raised 6 children, and lived to the age of 77, a long life in contrast to the tragic events she had witnessed. Then there was Mercy Lewis, at 19, one of the oldest among the accusers. Her past was filled with darkness. Her parents had been killed by the Wabanaki Native Americans. Fleeing from that trauma, she ended up in Salem as a servant to Thomas and Ann Putnam. She had once worked briefly for the accused, George Burroughs, and her testimony in 16 cases revealed her deep involvement in the trials. As an orphan without family standing in the community, like Elizabeth, she may have reveled in the power and attention the trials afforded her. After the trials ended, Mercy bore an illegitimate child, but eventually married, moving to Boston to start a new life with her family. The last of the key accusers was Mary Warren, 20 years old at the time. Initially, she displayed symptoms of affliction, but unlike the others, she quickly recovered when her employer, John Proctor, threatened her. John had been vocal in his opposition to the trials from the beginning, and his defiance made him a target. Mary, once spared, soon found herself accused of witchcraft. In the courtroom, when faced with accusations of faking her earlier symptoms, she collapsed into fits, mimicking the behavior of the other girls. Soon, she rejoined the ranks of the accusers and, in a cruel twist of fate, testified against both John and Elizabeth Proctor, leading to their executions. Like many of the accusers, her story fades into the unknown after the trials ended. What truly sparked the Salem witch trials remains a mystery. The colony was still young, only 60 years old, and steeped in superstition and religious fervor. Add personal vendettas, and the fires of hysteria burned bright. Perhaps it was all a tragic mix of fear and rivalry. Or, as some might still whisper, maybe the devil himself had paid a visit to Salem.